corporate. And now I think I'll give an introduction in Italian, so it may amuse Tom Hazlett and his family. Siamo partiti? Okay. Buongiorno, grazie per aver sfidato la calura. Ne vale la pena perché siamo qui oggi a parlare di un libro veramente molto bello. Questo libro si intitola The Political Spectrum, non so come farlo vedere, non so bene dove sia la cosa, ed è una fatica complessa, un libro che Tom Hazlett ha scritto in alcuni anni e che riesce a costruire, a ripercorrere la storia della regolamentazione dello spettro hertziano, quindi radio prima e soprattutto telecomunicazioni poi, letteralmente come recita il titolo del nostro seminario, da Marconi all'iPhone. Questa è una storia principalmente americana, per come ci viene raccontata. Ma questa storia americana ha in realtà delle implicazioni molto forti anche per vicende che a noi sono più vicine. Sostanzialmente cose che ogni tanto noi associamo al contesto europeo e al contesto italiano soprattutto esistono anche oltreoceano, a cominciare dalla fairness doctrine, che in realtà richiama tutta una serie di problemi che conosciamo bene anche da noi sino alla famosa parking meter. Questo è un libro molto bello perché è un libro sulla storia della regolamentazione, ma nello stesso tempo è pieno di aneddoti, di storie divertenti, di esperienze talora tragiche, talora invece molto simpatiche. Ma scusate, riprendo molto banalmente la recensione che ho scritto al libro, non sto copiando da altri se non da me stesso, perché un elemento centrale nella storia che racconta Tom Hazlett è un'intervista veramente straordinaria a Mark Fowler, nominato presidente della Federal Communication Commission da Ronald Reagan, il quale a un certo punto, ragionando sulla regolamentazione della televisione, regolamentazione che atteneva non solo i contenuti ma anche le modalità di trasmissione, che secondo Hazlett è stata responsabile di un vero stallo dell'innovazione per alcuni anni. A un certo punto Fowler in questa intervista si chiese: come mai ci concentriamo su una sola forma, le trasmissioni televisive, e le attribuiamo specifici compiti sociali quando non facciamo lo stesso con altri media? Perché siamo ossessionati dall'idea di manomettere questo scatolone di transistor e tubi catodici quando non facciamo la stessa cosa con una rivista? Quell'intervista di Fowler impose l'idea che la televisione era né più né meno un tossapane, che non ci fosse differenza tra la regolamentazione di quell'oggetto lì, non ci fosse un bisogno di governare i contenuti, bisogno in Italia ha sentito fortissimo ovviamente per tante vicende, come voi avrete letto il libro di Franco di Antonio Pilati, Guerra dei 30 anni, ma in realtà sentito, avvertito come tale anche per gli Stati Uniti, e il passaggio a una forma di regolamentazione più neutrale, sostiene Hazlett, è ciò che ha consentito un'esplosione di innovazione, per esempio nell'ambito degli smartphone in stagione più recente. Di Tom Hazlett sapete già dalle slide che insegna economia alla Clemson University, ha insegnato in altre università, perché la Clemson University per molto tempo, è stato capo economista della Federal Communication Commission, ma ha avuto anche una lunga esperienza da giornalista, aveva un libro su Financial Times, ha scritto molto, ha fatto delle bellissime interviste per Reason Magazine. Da bambino ha fatto un'intervista a Hayek che potete vedere ancora su internet. Non è la sua unica performance da bambino che potete vedere, questa è una vicenda personale da quale ne parlerà lui più tardi. Questo vissuto, questa storia da giornalista si vede nella qualità letteraria di questo libro. È un libro tanto denso quanto bello, divertente, piacevole, So you can trust me, I just said very nice things about you so far. It's a great pleasure to give the floor to Tom for introducing us to this book. This is not the first seminar about this book he gives in Europe. He's been in Switzerland, London, Belgium, and other places, Zurich, but I've said Switzerland before. So Bonn in the last couple of weeks. So it's sort of a European tour. We're very, very happy to have him back.
Well, thank you, Alberto, and of course it's a great honor to be here at the Bruno Leoni Institute, and I have read Freedom of the Law, and I've known about your good work here for some time, and this is a wonderful honor. I am happy to be from a university. By the way, just to clear this up, we do have a tiger paw as our symbol at Clemson University. That's because if you read about us in a major American publication, it'll probably be about our football team, and it will say nothing about our academics. So we're the national championship team in football. American football.
Well, it was censorship over American football.
That's right, anyway. So this is the book, it's just out, and it is a book that focuses about radio waves and how we regulate them. It is not a technical book. You don't have to be an expert to understand it. In fact, if you're an expert, you might be disappointed that there's not more specific minutiae in the book. These are stories about economics and politics and how they apply to our daily lives. And it is written from the standpoint of an American looking at mostly U.S. institutions. There are some international discussions in the book, maybe not enough. This book could be written for every country on the face of the earth. And I hope you do write one for Italy. And I hope there is, because the Italian story is really interesting with broadcasting and the free speech rights, breaking open the broadcasting market. Anyway, there's just so many interesting stories about our world that come out of communications and the rise of communications over the last 100 years. So this is the book we have out now, just out from Yale University Press. It is available on Amazon. Watch the screen carefully. This is the new marketing technique.
It's nothing on the screen at the moment,
nothing?
So we're trying to reactivate it. Devi togliere e mettere la corrente, credo.
Non è una questione di internet.
No, è proprio di corrente, anche la corrente. No.
Right here.
Okay, it's going up. It's sort of it's the Italian version of the Fairness Doctrine. He didn't like it advertised. He thought advertising
Enjoyment matters.
This looks like my lecture, the same thing. You spend the first 15 minutes figuring out the audio visual. That's great.
That's okay.
It's okay now? You think it's coming? Search it. There's the book. Okay. So now you have to look at the screen because this is important. Okay, this is the latest. No, watch the screen. There you go. There you go. You'll be buying books in your sleep now. Go on, and you won't even know. You'll have 10 books delivered the next 2 days, Amazon Prime. So anyway, I do want to remember to say thank you to the Institute, and of course to Alberto, who's an international tour de force, and he's well known to many of us in the United States and around the world as a great thinker and a great doer. And I'm delighted that I know him. And also to another Italian that I know you mentioned in the introduction, because I was listening, Mark Fowler and Guglielmo Marconi. And I wanted Marconi's name on the cover of my book. I have a wonderful editor, the publisher is great, but we do get into some disagreements. And the subtitle that I have on the book was From Guglielmo Marconi to the iPhone, The Quest to Liberate Wireless Technologies of Freedom. That was mine. You can see that's not on the cover. We have Herbert Hoover's name, a former US president, who's not on the cover for being a president. He was the first regulator of radio as the Secretary of Commerce in the US government in the 1920s. We'll talk about that a little bit. Anyway, it's a wonderful connection to what I have to talk about. And in fact, it seems funny to most people. It's just kind of the idea that we communicate through radio waves seems even today somewhat like a magic trick. And it's always been that way. Of course, Marconi, British and Italian dual citizen, figures out in 1895 how to send signals from one radio to another and actually transmit voice communications. And that was a big thing. We did have a telegraph that could do that for a few decades before, and that started, of course, with just electrical impulses, Morse code, dots and dashes. Then it became voice communications with a telephone system by the 1870s. And now we have something that's actually named for what it's not, wireless. And that shows you how important it is to take away the wire. It gives you this mobility, this distance, just on a very economical basis. Two radios communicating with each other through dead space. By the way, early people thought there was an ether, a gas, through which the radios traveled. That's why it was called the ether. Even in legislation in the United States, it was called the ether. It turns out there is no gas, and you don't need any atmosphere for the signals to travel. They go through dead space, and the contents of the atmosphere make some difference to the communications properties, but none to the reality of wireless communications. So we've gone through this idea. In fact, there's a famous quote attributed to Albert Einstein. He supposedly said in 1938 that the telegraph was like a long cat. You pulled the tail in Los Angeles and it meowed in New York. Wireless is the same, but without the cat. I believe he never said that. People actually look for that, but like a lot of quotes from famous people, that's just out there. That's quoted everywhere in this kind of literature. And but it shows you the magic and the trick that even Albert Einstein or smart people in general would think this. In fact, in 1939, television was being debuted at the New York World's Fair, and there was a demonstration, a television set, so people could see these moving pictures transmitted through space. The actual set was a special production. They made it enclosed in glass. And why did they do that? They did that because there were rumors that there were in fact no wireless transmissions, that there were little tiny actors on a miniature stage inside a box. And they wanted to show people, no, people are not running around inside. They're actually tubes and wires and electrical gadgets that are making this picture happen. So that bit of magic has been with us. Now, of course, today, kids grow up totally taking all this for granted. They just open up the device, go online, they ask for the Wi-Fi connection, and they're gone. And you see them 5, 10, 15 years later. Wireless is a social amenity. It's something we all do. It's part of our daily lives. And I think that's a step in the right direction, but there's still, when people sit down to think about radio waves and how the whole business gets regulated, that's still a bit of a mystery. Okay, now it's more important because of the ubiquity of the services and because we have seen what happens when there is an opening of the marketplace, and that's what we're going to talk about today. By the way, I did not ignore Mr. Marconi, and one of the things we did do yesterday, I had to visit via Marconi, and it is, I think, the sense of humor of the Italians comes through to put these old pay telephones on via Marconi, and of course they're wired, old wireline pay phones, which I think is a bit of an insult to the spirit of Marconi, but it's got a sense of humor to it, so I did appreciate it. That was yesterday, yeah. So, just in terms of what we're going to talk about, this is everything. Okay, this is a book on written by an economist about what many think is a technical field, but it has a lot of law, a lot of history, economics, free speech. You mentioned the fairness doctrine, I think. Public choice, how political interests combine to create law. Obviously, the importance of technological change, and then every social revolution you want to mention, every challenge, mobile health, the singularity, human. And the basic story of my book, in brief, is this, that there's a very fascinating origins to the regulatory regime in the United States that's completely misunderstood, miscited, and of widespread myth, not just in the United States, but around the world. It led to a regulatory system that did not work. And it created something even the regulators themselves would have come to call the vast wasteland. Just having a great resource, radio spectrum. By the way, European regulators like to call radio spectrum the economic oxygen of the modern economy. And it surely is. But we've been wasting spectrum, and we've been producing through television and squandered opportunities with lack of competition, lack of technological deployments. We've been producing very disappointing results. And I would call them visionaries, arose to criticize this system. Some were economists like Ronald Coase. Some were actually regulators. Some were entrepreneurs who just took advantage of new rules or actually created new rules so that new technologies, systems, and competitive platforms could actually exist in a new and better world. And there is a very ironic liberalization. This is not a depressing story. Yes, we've had some terrible policy, and we still have it. We still have the 1920s rules in the United States, in the EU, around the world. We have the old, century-old regime. But we've also had advocates for liberalization. And in fact, liberalization has gone a considerable distance. Not nearly far enough, not anywhere near halfway. But we have come up with proof of concept in markets today, wireless markets, that are vastly more open than the markets of the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s. And we have trouble pushing reforms further. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, what we can do to improve that. But we do have proof of concept. We know that we allow markets to operate freely and competitively with property rights assigned for frequencies, that those kinds of decentralized systems vastly outperform the centralized allocation systems that came in the United States and elsewhere almost a century ago. So I'll illustrate that with two stories about two different technologies. One, the brainchild of an American inventor called Edwin Armstrong, I'll introduce you to, and another by them attributed to a man who you probably know, Steve Jobs. And I'll conclude by saying all it takes is more spectrum, and we have to figure out ways to get that in the market. Okay. So after Marconi invents radio, you know about radio spectrum because there aren't many radios out there. I mean, for starting, there's only one guy with a radio, and he had two of them, and he could make them work or not make them work, as the case may be. There's no congestion in airspace. There's no contentiousness. And for a few years, everything goes on an experimental basis, and then there's some applications developed. The first big application, depending upon how you want to look at it, ship-to-shore radio. Obviously, it's very important to have an untethered device on a boat in the middle of the ocean. And then we also got wireless to compete with telegraph, sending pictures and news to newspapers, news organizations. Then, of course, financial markets wanted to get news faster. Financial markets started getting radios. There's still, it's an early age, there aren't many radios out there, and the radios are sold in pairs. Okay, if you want a radio to communicate with another radio, you have two radios, they form a beam between them, and they communicate. There's not much conflict. In fact, in 1912, there was famous the ocean. This was tragically where an Italian-American named Leonardo DiCaprio was lost at sea. And you know him, but sad story there. But in this tragedy, the problem, there was a radio problem. The radio problem was that the Titanic sent radio SOS signals to other ships at sea to ask for a rescue. And the closest ship had actually, this was in the middle of the night, about 11:45 p.m., plus or minus a half an hour. The closest ship had actually had its radio operator go to sleep and close up shop. Didn't listen. That was I believe that was the California. The Carpathian was many hours away. And finally got there about 7 in the morning. They were farther away. They got the signals, and they saved some people, but not many. Most of the people in the freezing water were gone at that point. And so anyway, this became a policy issue. There was a radio act passed in 1912 in the United States to mandate that all the major ships at sea have 24-hour radio operators to get signals so that they could communicate with each other. So there was still no conflict in the airspace, and World War I, the military comes and looked at radio, and radios are used heavily by military establishments across the world. Then something happens. In 1920, a new business model in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a company with adopting the call sign KDKA, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, starts broadcasting. Broadcasting is an agricultural term. Okay, instead of planting seeds one at a time, you broadcast them. And this was a different way to do it. Instead of sending a signal, a message, point to point, you try to communicate with everyone. You just blast out at high power. You want to communicate with as many radio receivers, one way, some content. And by the way, who would do this? Who would put up the first radio transmitter? There are no receivers to make anything happen. On the other hand, who's going to sell a receiver, for that matter, buy a receiver if there are no transmitters? So I love to ask this to my economics students, because this is a classic case where the market is saved by vertical integration. A manufacturer of radios, Westinghouse, wanted to sell radios, so they put up this transmitter, KDKA, with a Westinghouse company. And they start transmitting. By the way, they start transmitting November 2nd, 1920. That's election day. In the 1920 presidential election, they wanted to communicate political news. They thought people might buy a radio and tune in. Well, what really happens is that all the other entrepreneurs in America are looking at this, and it seems like a great idea. Within 2 years, there are 500 of these full-power blasting broadcasting stations around the United States. Now, there can be conflict. Now, there may be a situation where you have a radio receiver and it is having trouble because of these high-power emissions coming from another radio receiver on a same or similar frequency in the same or similar geographic area. And so questions immediately arose, what do we do about this? There's a very standard story that's believed, you read it in history books to this day, in communications texts. And it's I like this term a lot, this comes from the United States Navy, etheric bedlam. Etheric bedlam. That there was just complete, utter confusion in the airways. Etheric bedlam. By the way, this is bedtime at the Hazlett house, etheric bedlam. Also another application. Yes. Bedlam. But the United States Supreme Court has the official description of what happened, and their official description in 2 Supreme Court cases, I call it myth calculation. That's a play on words. I don't know if any of this translates. Calculation is a common word. I call it myth calculation, but I know that translations are difficult. And I'll try not to tell too many jokes.
No. Oh, indulge yourself.
Well, because I think of President Jimmy Carter, who I once heard give a speech, and he made a joke. This is back at the University of California, Davis, true story, and nobody laughed. And he apologized for not telling funny jokes. And then he said, you know, the only time I told that joke where I got a big response was in Japan, where it was the speech was being translated. And he said, he told the joke, and the audience roared with laughter for a minute. And after the speech, he said, I have to find the translator. And asked the translator how he told the joke. And he said, I never gotten a good response like that. So after the speech, he does find the translator, and the translator says, yes. He says, I told the audience, the President of the United States made a very funny joke. Please laugh. So the Japanese are very polite. So they just laughed and laughed. And so that's what you have. Cross language, that's anyway, so this is the United States Supreme Court rendition of what's happening, and what they say is very clear. Before 1927, the allocation of frequencies was left entirely to the private sector, and the result was chaos. Without government control, the media would be of little use because of the cacophony of competing voices. And those are from two opinions. I will note that for those of you who did take English and get an A in it, this is misspelled. That should be an O. So this was prior to spell check. Supreme Court misspelled the key word, and I always keep that misspelling in there, okay? And I think I say in the book, the misspelling is not the primary error in this sentence. There's a lot more wrong with that. But I like the fact the Supreme Court got the spelling wrong. So here's what actually happened. I mentioned there's a 1912 radio law, and what it did was it told the Secretary of Commerce to issue licenses to anybody who applied, and then to use that licensing or registration system to minimize interference. And so what was happening already by the early 1920s to keep order and to encourage development of the industry was that this man, Herbert Hoover, an engineer, a very successful engineer, one of the first graduates of Stanford University, had just a tremendous career, became famous in Europe in 1918, 1919 in the Belgian relief program. It got a statue in his honor in Brussels. He saved millions in the post-war hunger relief programs in an international effort. Anyway, he became Secretary of Commerce in 1921. And the Commerce Department had the ability to enforce rules of the road under this 1912 statute. And the rules they adopted were from common law. This would be near and dear to freedom of the law. And those rules basically go like this. If a person or company discover how to use a natural resource, do so beneficially, delivering benefits to the public, and some other party encroaches on that ability, the productive enterprise has the right to, under law, claim common law ownership, property rights. And indeed, this idea, which is called many different things, priority in use, adverse possession, first in time, first come, first served, right of first appropriation, homesteading rights, pioneers' preferences, squatters' rights. All of these names apply in different contexts to the same basic idea. It was exactly what was happening in radio. Entrepreneurs were investing capital and creating broadcast systems that were extremely valuable and popular. And Hoover was enforcing the law. There are many ways I can explain this. I can show you statistics. By 1926, without any new government statute on radio, there were 4 million households with radios. Now, these are not tiny little radio chips or transistor radios, cheap radios that we know today. These were the radios that in today's dollars would cost well over $1,000, big consoles. Selling those radios was not easy, but this was a very popular new killer application of the 1920s. This was the start of the mass electronic communication era. Okay, and I'll give you one picture. This made this is what the government wrote later. 6 years of orderly development under these first come first served rules. But this is the cover that I like because it's so contemporary. By 1926, radio is such a ubiquitous and important application. No chaos. Okay, this is not chaos. With chaos, you don't get this. You don't get 4 million households with radio. But this is the cover of a magazine at the time, and you can see that it is their wedding night. And she, the bride, is alone at last, and he is fiddling with his electronic device. And of course, the charming thing is how contemporary this is, although we have gender equity. And you can just as likely see him sitting on the bed crying as she fiddles with her smartphone, ignoring him while she's snapping all of her friends all over the planet on their wedding night. You can certainly see that. Now, what happens is that Hoover is very dissatisfied. Hoover is a political actor, and he had a lot of agreement with us on other political actors. He's very dissatisfied with the politics, well, radio is emerging as a powerful medium of public opinion. And there's no real regulation. There's traffic cop function, there's rules on the road, but Hoover keeps saying, yes, we've had this orderly development, but we want more power to regulate who broadcasts and what they say. Okay? Who broadcasts what they say. Now, this is also the individual who ends up sponsoring the radio after 1927 is of the opposite political party, a Democrat, who were a Republican. But Senator C.C. Dill writes a book after he leaves the Senate in 1937, writes a book that says this explicitly. We did not want to lose the opportunity to regulate. What Hoover does, he tries for years to get a law giving him some authority to determine who broadcasts and what they say in some jurisdiction over content. He doesn't get it. There's an impasse. People keep saying to Hoover, the system's working, why fix it? So what he does, in the summer of 1926, he unilaterally stops enforcing the rules. It's on a given day, July 9th, 1926. What we are today? Oh, July 9th, 1926. One day and 91 years ago. Puts out a press release. We're not going to enforce the law. We don't have the authority. There were two conflicting court opinions, and Hoover chose the one that gave him less power, which is extraordinary for a political actor, and didn't appeal it. He said, no, we don't have the power. It's very clear that he didn't want that power. He wanted more legislation, had not been able to get it, and now he stops ruling first come, first served enforcement. And there is chaos. There are 200 new stations come pouring into the market. Some stations move around. There's still a lot of radios being sold, but there's an actual decline in the growth. And at that moment, there is what they call, contemporaneously, the period of the breakdown of the law. There had been law, now there's a breakdown. There is, for 7 months, chaos. This is a 7-month problem, not a 1920 to 1927 problem. That's a very important fact. During this period, there's an actual common law case that goes to trial, and it's in Chicago. And here's a joke that won't translate. In the United States, if you want to understand property rights, you go to Chicago. Okay, that didn't translate, just like I. But the University of Chicago and the graft and corruption of the city government of Chicago would all tell you that they understand property very well there. And those are the two noted aspects of Chicago. But at any rate, what happens is there's a radio station in Chicago that's owned by the Chicago Tribune, the big newspaper. And the station is called WGN, which was named for world's greatest newspaper. Marketing, communications, world's greatest newspaper. And during this period where there's no federal enforcement, WGN, it's a pretty successful station, has another station move closer. And they claim it interferes with their signal. And they go in a state court, tell the judge, you have to give us the property right for our airwave. Because we established a property right, and now they've encroached. And the judge agrees. And in November of 1926, here's the headline when it comes out: court fixes radio rights on air, WGN wins, wavelength decision sets U.S. precedent, aerial property rights defined. Okay, this property rights were understood. It was understood they could enforce property rights. Now, there's some confusion as to whether or not the federal government would help. There may need to be a law to explain and clarify, but everybody understood that this could establish order. It had kept order for 6 years, and now we can enforce property rights to the air this way and eliminate the chaos. By the way, here's another joke that may not translate. If you go back 100 years just to see, this is not part of my story here, indict a municipal judge, the headline. But if you go back 100 years and just look at a random headline in a Chicago newspaper, you're liable to see a public official going to prison. So that's just random. That's just collateral damage there. By the way, this was during our prohibition, so this judge was part of a rum net. This is a bootlegging or smuggling operation. So that's a little call for history. Throw it in for free. So this is what happens. There's chaos for a little bit, and that's orchestrated by this radio regulator, Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce. There is a fix, property rights, and the political actors finally get their compromise together to regulate. They want to regulate. And by the way, they are driven very strongly by the most successful commercial radio stations. Because during this period, companies like Westinghouse and RCA, Radio Corporation of America, they come in Zenith, another big company, they come in and establish very successful radio stations, and they do not want this property rights, common law environment, because it implies that new stations can continue to come in and use new radio spectrum to compete. They wanted a public interest licensing law that gave the government a legal rationale for cutting off new entry. And so the radio stations in 1925 actually formed their own trade association, the National Association of Broadcasters, and asked Hoover and the policymakers, please give us new legislation that has a public interest standard for allocating spectrum and licenses. And that's what happens. February of 1927, February 23rd, just 90 years ago, the Federal Radio Act comes in. It establishes a commission to allocate radio spectrum. It's called the Federal Radio Commission. The name has changed in 1934. Nothing else changes. We have the Federal Communications Commission today, FCC. The standard for allocating airwaves, public interest. It can mean anything the government wants it to say. It explicitly preempts property rights, called vested rights, in the ether, in the radio spectrum. You cannot assert an ownership right against the government. It was a political bargain, a rent-seeking equilibrium, if you will, where the incumbent commercial radio stations got together with the incumbent politicians, the policymakers like Hoover and Senator Dill, a Democrat from the state of Washington, and said, we will restrict entry into the market. That will make the radio stations that have licenses much more profitable, and we will give regulators some authority to regulate. Equal time rule for political candidates for public office, the fairness doctrine, regulating the content according to where the regulators want the content to be, prohibition on foreign ownership of U.S. radio stations, violation of WTO rules. All that comes in under the premise that we're eliminating chaos. It has nothing to do with chaos. Who owns the radio station, of course. Only the rules of who can, what frequencies are used where. Immediately, there's an elimination of 200 radio stations from the market. These are smaller stations. Many of them were non-profit stations who were competing with the major commercial stations that got everything they wanted, including free renewals. And there's no new spectrum. The radio dial for AM radio today in the United States is essentially the same that was put out in the marketplace and available in 1924. With all the technology that's come, with all the new useful bandwidth that was available, even at the time, even in 1927, that has been restricted by the system adopted for regulation, the public interest licensing rule. Okay? So there's a whole litany of entrants that arise to compete into the market who are silenced, who are rejected. And this long history stems from what I call the political spectrum, what we got in 1927. The myth is that we had to do this. We had to have the government centralize order and coordinate everything from the middle of the market. But that's not what happened. In fact, we had a very orderly system of competition, and it could have grown and expanded under those rules. In fact, the major players in the market, private and public, wanted a system that could be controlled by a coalition of these political interests. And the result was, in fact, what I call the political spectrum. Administrative frequency allocations, not a market where the airwaves go to the highest value use. Public interest is a very vague standard. You justify whatever this political equilibrium wants. And when you have a new technology, this is not my phrase, this is what FCC Chairman Long called it, there's a system of mother may I. You have to take your new idea for wireless to the government. You have to tell the government what your business model is, what your technology is. You have to reveal everything and then say, look, we think this is a good use of radio spectrum. Please allow me to come into the market. And oh, by the way, all the incumbents will be ready for you. And they will ask lots of questions because they want to protect their market. And they have shareholders to protect as well. And that's the system that we have all the way until today, but there has been a lot of change in the system. There has been liberalization within the system. So let me give you two examples of how this works. Just two technologies that come online and try to break into the market. And we'll see how differently things are 2 or 3 generations ago versus today. So I'm going to start with 1934. And what was happening in 1934? Well, that's an old 1941 radio that comes out of what I'm going to talk about. And of course, what we jumped to in 2007 is familiar to you. We'll get to that in a moment. Edwin Howard Armstrong was a great American inventor. That's a 1922 picture. He was a professor at Columbia University. He graduated, he was an undergraduate. He was interested in radio. So when he was interested in radio in 1913, when he graduated as an undergrad, he was born in 1890. When you went to school, you studied physics, and he did very well in physics, so well that he had several inventions patented as an undergraduate. And when he graduated, he wanted to go to graduate school at Columbia, so Columbia accepted him as a graduate student and said, you know, you're going to do great in your studies, so congratulations on getting into our program. And by the way, we'd like to also have you on the faculty teaching classes while you go as a graduate student. So keep that in mind, Maryland. He does well, goes into World War I, works for the Allies. The French give him the Eiffel Tower to do radio experiments. He ends up being a major in the U.S. Army, very patriotic, love that. In fact, called himself Major Armstrong, not Professor Armstrong, even though he was a lifelong professor at Columbia. So in 1922, he's back doing his work. I love this picture. This is the world's first portable radio. 1923, he gets married, gives his wife a portable radio. And one of the things I love about the picture is they're on the beach for the honeymoon. He's got a full suit on. And that's pretty cool. Not cool, I guess. That's the way it was. Anyway, so he's a great inventor, and he's part of AM radio, and he's contributing with David Sarnoff and the RCA Corporation, doing a lot of the things that, and he also, you know, Marconi was, the British Marconi company was involved in competing in that market. 1934, he comes up with a big improvement on AM radio, and it's called FM. Amplitude modulation is now being rivaled by frequency modulation. And here's that picture I showed you of an FM radio that's early on. And in fact, you won't recognize this dial, 42 to 50 megahertz. What happens is, Mother May, this new technology comes into the market. Armstrong, one of the great inventors of the century, very famous in the United States, goes to the regulators. He says, I have shown this radio to radio professionals, engineers. They have certified it's the most fantastic radio technology ever, and I need radio spectrum. It's 1934. It takes until the very end of the 1930s to get radio spectrum. The regulators, how did the regulators process that, by the way? They checked with all of their experts, and all of their experts said it didn't even work. Because all of their experts worked for AM radio companies. Okay, so this is just a natural kind of, now, again, Armstrong was extremely famous, extremely credible, had all the science on his side. After several years, he does succeed in getting an allocation. And in 1939, he's making radios. He's building, with his own personal fortune and some new investors, a radio network in the northeastern United States. By the end of 1941, there are 500,000 of these big new FM radio consoles, again, costing more than $1,000 in today's dollars. There are 500,000 in the northeastern United States. High fidelity is on the market. And then, you'll know I'm an American when I say, and then, in December 1941, World War II starts. So this is what Americans believe. December 7th, 1941 was the start of World War II. And all civilian production of radio stops, and Armstrong goes back into the military, and everything's on hold. At the end of the war, 1945, the projections are, with all the good reviews that they've gotten on this fantastic new high-fidelity device, that there are going to be 5 million radios a year sold. But something happens. The Federal Communications Commission, heavily lobbied by new television interests that are also allied with the old AM radio interests, decide to destroy FM radio, and in fact they do. They say that there has to be a move, a shift in the entire FM dial. 42 to 50, where 500,000 people and a whole network of radio transmitters are operating, that has to be moved. Now, you can't just move it because these other interests say we want to move it. There has to be a public interest reason. So the reason, and it's as absurd as it sounds, the reason that was given by the Federal Communications Commission in 1945 was sunspots. It was said by the regulators that there was a unique problem with solar flares disrupting FM, only FM, not television, not anything else, only FM, only in 42 to 50 megahertz. Now, if there had been, and they were going to move the entire band to a different band where there was no technology yet for FM radio. If there had been any truth to this, Armstrong and all of his co-investors in FM would have loved to have gotten out of the problem and gotten into spectrum. They were apoplectic. They protested bitterly. Armstrong put abundant documentation in the record that there was no sunspot problem. It didn't make any difference. The regulators wanted to move, and they did entirely move FM radio to where you know FM radio today, 88 to 100 or 108 megahertz on the dial. So that was a dead zone. The old FM radios were finished. People had bought these expensive sets. By the time, in a few years, that Armstrong had created new technology for transmission and reception, they could not sell the radios. Why? Not because the quality hadn't been great, but because the business proposition had been terrible. Hundreds of thousands of people had bought radios that very quickly could not work, and that in the marketplace was enough to kill radio for another 15 years. Now, by the time the 60s rolled around and some more deregulation took place where FM radio could fully compete with AM, it ended up totally dominating AM radio. The quality is so much better. Armstrong was right. The initial regulatory reaction was wrong. Armstrong never got to see the dominance of FM radio. He committed suicide, totally despondent over the FM allocation and assassination of his product, his innovation. He commits suicide in 1954. So this happens, maybe not in quite as dramatic fashion, with all kinds of technologies, including cable TV in the 1960s, completely put on the back burner for 20 years. Cellular technology comes into the market through Bell Labs in 1945, but can't get into the market, can't get spectrum until the 1980s. That's blocked for decades. Low power FM broadcasting is still blocked today. 100,000 radio stations could exist, they do not exist. Satellite radio broadcasting, much less than what it is because of protection for terrestrial broadcasting. And other technologies you haven't even heard of that can't get into the market because of bad regulation. Now, this is just a killing field for innovation. And the regulators notice that this is not going very well. And in fact, the most famous speech ever given by any US regulator comes in 1961. It's given by the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, a man by the name of Newton Minow. And he lectures the National Association of Broadcasters at their annual convention in Las Vegas. And he says, you have healthy profits, but your product is abysmal. If you watch television, there were only 3 national networks at the time. This is thanks to US regulation that demanded that there couldn't be any more than 3. He said the product is mindless sitcoms, violent westerns, endless commercials. It's the waste of the day. I challenge you to sit down at a television set and actually look at what you're producing for the American public. And by the way, you are using valuable public resources, the airwaves. I'm going to go back to Washington and I'm going to get tough on looking at your license renewals. There's a new sheriff, a new cop on the beat, and I'm going to make sure you actually do the public interest with these valuable licenses that you have and have gotten for free. Okay? Minow was absolutely hailed as a prophet. He was the front page in newspapers all over the country. He got awards. To this day, anniversaries of the Vast Wasteland speech are big news. The 50th anniversary in 2011, the Atlantic Monthly did a big story on it, had Newton Minow back and other people hailing him as a prophet for all this. The only reaction by the television industry, I should say, is that there was a television show debuting in 1964 called Gilligan's Island about a party that was shipwrecked on a South Pacific island. A 3-hour cruise turns into a 3-year run on television, and they called the shipwreck the SS Minnow. See, that was trying to tweak the FCC chair, but it wasn't that funny anyway, but I don't know if that translates either. Anyway. So this actually results in nothing positive from what the chairman has threatened. There were no new forms, even though he said we're going to have new forms to fill out, it's going to be tough. No new forms. But instead, what happens is that the commission blocks competition. In other words, while saying to the television industry, you have a terrible product and we are going to fix this problem, they do the reverse. Cable television, seeing how bad television choice was in the United States, no diversity and little quality, actually builds spectrum on its own. Spectrum in a tube. Cable television. You can't use the over-the-air delivery mechanism, which is regulated, but you can put cables into households. That was not regulated. That changes in 1962, when the federal government now asserts authority for the first time over cable TV and blocks it to protect, explicitly protect broadcasting, saying that broadcasting delivers news, information, and public affairs of importance to a democracy, and we regulate these stations in the public interest. We can't have competition, siphoning their profits. Okay? So cable is actually blocked until deregulation in the late 1970s. Now, with that deregulation, and I'll talk about how successful that deregulation was, that's how we got news, information, and public affairs programming in the United States, and we have hundreds of channels of it, and we have all kinds of diversity. We have high-quality programming, and we have low-quality programming. But we always have low-quality programming. Now the new stuff is the great opportunity that has unfolded due to the liberalization. And that came at the same time is called the toaster model. And in regulation in the United States, the second most famous thing after the Vast Wasteland speech ever said by an FCC regulator was given in an interview in Reason magazine in 1981 by the Reagan-appointed chairman of the FCC, Mark Fowler. And he said, this is a generation ago or more, 1981, television is just another appliance. It's just a toaster with pictures. And what he means by that is why we have all these special rules about content and equal time rule and fairness doctrine and public interest. We don't have those special rules with toasters. We just have competitive markets. And we let consumers choose what kind of product they want. Why don't we have that for broadcasting? Okay? Now that is vilified. That is absolutely a crazy statement according to most things you read in the United States. We have a game show, a very popular game show called Jeopardy. And as recently as just 5 years ago, there was all these, the quiz is you get the answer and then you have to state the question. So here's the answer. Mad Men for 800, that was the category. Mad Men for 800. In the 80s, growing broadcast empires had help from the mad monk of deregulation, Mark Fowler of this commission. What is the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC? So this is famous everywhere, that he said that there should be a toaster model. That made him the mad monk of deregulation. So it turns out Fowler's approach was adopted by Democrats and Republicans. And it was enormously successful. You don't see that in the contemporary view of things, but the minimalist regulation first comes to cable TV in the late 1970s, the early 1980s. Cable unleashes, the country is wired for competing television, and this is what we get. We get full-time public affairs. I don't know if you're familiar with C-SPAN. Go to cspan.org if you want to see tens of thousands of hours of public interest programming. Debates, not just presidential debates in the general election, but the primaries, the governorships, all the stuff that's not on broadcasting, because there's too little and there's too much regulation. CNN, full-time news channels. We have competing ideologies now. HBO, commentary, Comedy Central. I don't know if you get all of these, but I know you get hundreds, and we have hundreds. And we, with deregulation of the U.S. market in the late 70s, early 80s, led the way. Hundreds, almost 1,000 television channels in the United States, delivers all the things we're supposed to be protected for broadcast, but never came. Then the age of mobile wireless comes. And after a long, long lag, cellular finally ignites a new world. We get licenses for cellular in the United States 1984 to 1989. That's called 1G, or first generation. You're familiar with it here in Europe because it quickly spreads. And that's the analog system. It's still pretty well regulated. One great breakthrough. By the time cellular gets to the market, competition is plausible. When the government of the United States first considers making rules for cellular in 1970, it is decided by the wise men that only one company could exist in the cellular market. It was a natural monopoly. And in fact, the natural monopoly could only be provided by the wireline monopoly in the United States, AT&T. You could not even have an independent monopoly providing the service. That falls away. By the 1980s, the radical notion of two competing companies is not only entertained, it is put into policy by, of course, the late 1980s. 2G licenses are being issued in Europe that got the jump and actually took the lead over the United States. And now you've got multiple, 3, 4, or more, multiple operators in each market. That idea that monopoly was not the way of the world, that you could have competition, hugely important. What's happening by the end of the 1980s in the United States and many other markets, however, is that the technology mandates are actually being eliminated. So that for phone licenses, mobile phones, companies themselves get to test out different technologies. You could have GSM, or CDMA, or IBM, which was a US technology, or then later WiMAX coming into the market, and other kinds of services can be added, things like testing and mobile internet. These were not defined in the license. They were not specified by law. They were at the discretion of the operator. So the use of the radio spectrum is now becoming flexible. By 1993, the United States goes to license auctions, a radical notion proposed in 1959 by the economist Ronald Coase, laughed at, vilified, mocked, and derided as though it were impossible to do it. By the middle 1990s, you're having auctions in Europe, around the world, Australia, New Zealand, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nigeria, Canada, all over the world. Asia's been slow. Europe, Africa, the United States, and the Americas, fairly quick on that. Australia, New Zealand, very progressive. This really goes to a very much more liberal environment. And the upshot is that instead of having one government regulator deciding everything that goes into wireless, you're decentralizing and you're allowing operators with licenses to use radio spectrum on a liberal basis with broad, flexible use. You're allowing those operators to determine what radios, what networks, what services, what applications. And you go to a competitive environment instead of this top-down government dictate model. That makes all the difference in the world for the spectrum where this liberalization takes place. It's not that much of the spectrum, but it's extremely important. Now, why does this happen? Maybe it's because Ronald Coase was persuasive and the economist ideas came in. I'd like to think that, but the real story is probably a lot more complicated. And one of the things that happens is that the politics of broadcasting, which really determined the early spectrum allocation system and the legacy system that's still with us today, that changes with mobile telecommunications. The interest to control on behalf of government is not nearly so strong when you have a common carrier type of service where people are just talking to each other. There's still a lot of governments that want to control texting and tweeting and certainly mobile internet access, and you have governments around the world that do that. But in terms of actually regulating fairness doctrine and limiting access to radio spectrum so that there can be licenses to determine who broadcasts and what they say, is much less of a demand on the part of the governments for mobile, and it's much more complicated. The mobile systems are two-way radios that are moving in space, thousands, tens of thousands of base stations in Switzerland this week, and talking to regulators. They have 60, in a little tiny country with 8 million people, they've got 60,000 base stations. Okay, you can control broadcasting in Switzerland with three transmit towers essentially. You have 60,000 base stations, complicated technologies, radios moving in space. It's much more complicated. Regulators would actually like to download a lot to the efficiencies of the market, and they do. So the upshot is that cellular markets are everywhere more liberally regulated than broadcasting, absolutely everywhere. And this liberalization has gone a long way to deliver what we have today. And that brings me to my 2007 story about the way the system now performs. Think about Edwin Armstrong and his great FM radio. Had to run to Washington, D.C. and beg regulators, please give me spectrum. Couldn't buy it, couldn't pay for it, couldn't say I'll invest capital, and if I lose, it's my money. In 2005, a company in Cupertino, California had a big secret project, and it was the iPad. And then they decided the iPad should go on the back burner for a while, and the iPhone, a new radio, a new cell phone, should come into the market and provide something much better than what, an innovation people really wanted. The iPhone doesn't do very well without radio spectrum. Okay, it needs access to airwaves. In 1934, the only way to get access to airwaves was to ask the government permission, Mother May. In 2005, Apple could go to wireless carriers who themselves had permission to use airwaves in a flexible manner and, like the tiny FCCs they were, to figure out if they wanted the Apple iPhone on their network. So Apple could go into the market and they, as a company, could buy access to radio spectrum. And the question is, get radio. The consumer device that they produced was so popular that companies that had these very valuable rights, for which they had paid billions of dollars, billions, tens of billions of dollars, And then it's spent tens of billions of dollars more building networks to develop complementary infrastructure for. Those networks wanted the iPhone and would pay Apple to get it. That's a market. In the event, by the way, Apple started talking to Verizon, one carrier, couldn't work out a deal. Talked to Sprint, couldn't work out a deal. Finally went to AT&T. It worked out. An exclusive that lasted for 3 years. Apple got a big part of AT&T to do that. That's the way that market priced out. It's an absolutely fascinating story of how the liberal, flexible property rights to radio spectrum, having changed over the decades, allow the iconic device to get into the market. This story plays out in every country in the world. There are iPhones everywhere. Apple plays the carriers against each other. It gets the deal it wants. Sometimes it goes with exclusives. Sometimes it sells to everybody. Eventually, they almost always sell to everybody because they want the widest coverage for their phones, and they can drain some of the value of the rents by dealing with companies one after the next. But everywhere, networks have the iPhone, and Apple today is a wireless giant. How much was Apple, the company, worth in 2007? I looked this up the other day. It's not in the book. I don't think it's in the book. $30 billion in market cap. 10 years later, this is just June 29, 2007, 10 years in a few days. It's worth about $800 billion. Because of why? Wireless. iPhone and iPad. That's it. And there's no question. In fact, you see all kinds of articles about wireless giants. Apple, Google, Twitter, Amazon, Facebook, Snap. All these companies have no wireless infrastructure. They have no spectrum. They have no licenses. They buy access through deals in the market. You say, well, they don't pay anything. Well, they do pay through contracts, through partnerships, through applications that the carriers have to provide the platforms for. This is all worked out in a market, sometimes complicated, sometimes simple. Sometimes money changes hands directly. Sometimes it's what you call in the utility industry bill and keep. You bill your customer, we just cooperate in the market. And these kinds of deals. Now, Google, of course, is with Google Android and Google Play, a tremendous wireless ecosystem of its own, a direct response to Apple. Apple, that comes in with the iPhone in 2007 and absolutely decimates the #1 iPhone in the world at that time, or all the smartphones in the world. Nokia, dominant in the smartphone, if you will. BlackBerry, dominant in the business smartphone, if you will. Pushes business models in various directions, incites competition through the creation of Google Android, and Google, of course, not making handsets for the most part, but distributing operating system software and support for an ecosystem that brings in apps. There are more than 2 billion apps available. 2 million apps available, both at the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. iTunes, obviously, also a vertical for the content, music, and video, as well as books on the iPhone. Amazon comes into that space. Your Amazon Kindle works through downloads to the carriers, and so on and so forth. A market in spectrum through liberalization. Okay? So what's not to like? Oh, by the way, I had a short version of the book. If you don't want to read the book, this is the short version. Short History Radio Explains the iPhone Success. That was on the iPhone's 10-year anniversary, Harvard Business Review just a couple weeks ago. Okay. So all of this, can you imagine these apps? Can you imagine all this going through regulators on Mother May I? Do you understand that when you use the iPhone for Angry Birds or Pokemon, that it is interfering with other people on the network? That's an interference issue. That's chaos, according to the United States Supreme Court. That's etheric bedlam, according to the United States Navy. You have to have a central administrator do a public interest determination whether or not Angry Birds is more important than your 911 phone call, your emergency phone call. What's the emergency phone call? Who?
118.
118?
412.
4112?
No, 112.
112?
From 13.
118. 118. Various numbers. Okay. 118,
In
9/11.
this case, we've been lucky enough not to need one.
Okay, so anyway, who's determining who, you know, and in general, you know, these iPhones are just banded with hogs. They just take a lot of space away from others within the network. Don't you need the government to figure that out? The answer is yes, according to the United States Supreme Court. The only way you can do it, it's just a natural law that there'll be chaos if you don't have central direction. The correct answer, is you can't have the government doing it. You only get this when you liberalize, let the market compete to figure out the costs and benefits of anything new against anything old. Because protecting the old stuff is always important, and greeting the new capacity and new opportunity is also always important. As Coase pointed out in a very simple and elegant way in 1959, it was not understood then, and it's still unfortunately not fully understood today. What we want is a system where the incentives to figure out the information necessary about the costs and benefits of any new system are delegated to those who have the best incentives for figuring out the right answer and the best reaction or feedback loop when they succeed or fail. And that kind of thinking gets you quickly to consider what kind of market, whether it's an imposed market through central direction or a decentralized, deregulated, liberalized market through competing private firms and platforms, not all of them, not all of which have to be private companies. They can be public companies or trade associations or nonprofit institutions of some sort. But they are institutions that are competing with one another, and they have the opportunity to buy at a price, not have to go through a regulatory labyrinth to get a public interest determination. So all of what we know to be this great ecosystem for smartphones and mobile wireless completely takes over because of liberalization. And not just in the affluent world, where we love our expensive phones, but in the developing world, where we love our cheap phones. And of course, now this is fixed line. This is just simple numbers on fixed line communications in billions versus wireless communications. You can see this blue line, which is fixed, has been going down since about 2005. The number of fixed lines maxed out a little above 1 billion. And of course, since the early 2000s, wireless has surpassed, is now dominant. There are more than 6 billion wireless phone users in the world. More people have wireless phone subscriptions than have toothbrushes, which may be a sad fact, but there we are. And so this is all a product of liberalization, of having competition, of having private companies. Remember, 25 years ago, everything was state monopolies. The United States had the liberal environment because we had a private monopoly. But none of this competition took place, okay, prior to the 1980s, and then the 1990s in more of these places, and you just had state, you know, parastatals even in the 1990s being privatized, Telecom Italia, France Telecom, British Telecom, Bell Canada, Nippon Telephone and Telegraph in Japan, and those are the rich countries, okay? So this all happens through this liberalization regime. And I'll just say a little bit about Ronald Coase. We're going along, and I want to give a chance, obviously, for questions and drinking more water. But a great economist came into the middle of this debate years ago, and he said some things that I thought were cogent. He said, why don't we try markets? Why don't we try decentralization? Why don't we try this process that we now know has been so successful? In 1959, in a famous paper, he was mocked and derided. He went to the Federal Communications Commission. They made fun of him. First question from a commissioner, tell us, Professor Coase, are you spoofing us? Is this all a big joke? 20 years later, somebody at the FCC suggested they have auctions for FCC licenses. 2 commissioners actually put in an official document that there was no chance. There was as much chance there would ever be auctions as the Easter Bunny would win the Preakness. The Preakness is a horse race, a famous horse race in the United States. So part of the Triple Crown. They should have been betting on the bunny, because in fact, by the early 90s, and what were the first countries to auction licenses? not the US, New Zealand and India actually beat the US. We got there in 1994. So we have this long arc of liberalization coming from the visionary ideas, the switch to mobile broadcasting, and just the erosion of time and pressure on an inefficient system that keeps resisting competition and innovation. And with so much coming out of the scientific laboratories and so much visionary thinking pouring out of Silicon Valley and research centers from around the world, there's just a lot more interest in having open secondary markets where we allow companies that have licenses to use them flexibly and not have technology mandates, ex-ante planning where everything that goes in the market has to be explicitly okayed ahead of time. We can have experiments, incrementalism, you do something that works, you do something that doesn't work, you fix it. Okay, so these is how you get the mixed and evolving models, whether it be the iPhone, whether it be Google Play, whether it be the next innovation from into the mobile space, from the application world or from the network world. Okay, so I'll quickly buzz through it. We've become so successful with this that there is this mobile data tsunami where we have tremendous demand for mobile data, particularly video. And the question is, how do we add spectrum? We have, in the United States, maybe 15%, 15% of the tremendously productive, most productive spectrum that has been liberalized. We've got tremendous output from it. This new exciting wireless world is housed there. And there are problems because every time we do deregulate the rules, we do it just on a case-by-case basis. And every rulemaking takes, according to the government, 6 to 13 years. That's counting just the successful cases. In legal terms, this is called a tragedy of the anti-commons. Putting the rights together in a way that makes sense is very difficult. And so what you get is a lot of wasted spectrum because the ownership rights or the use rights are regulated in a way that really can't do very well. So this is also thought of as a holdup problem, and the classic example of it in the US, again, similar to other countries, we have TV licenses that were formalized in 1952, the 1952 TV allocation table. And it set aside huge bandwidth for over-the-air broadcast television, which at that time was the killer application for wireless. And the problem, of course, is not that there was television frequencies made available, it was the problem that they were mandated for television, they were limited to television, they fixed the technology, and they didn't allow an evolution that the spectrum could be used for other important stuff as television became less important. And of course today, over-the-air broadcast, terrestrial TV, is very unimportant in the marketplace. We got to the point years ago where cable television deregulated, and then satellite in the 1990s, we have 2 national satellite television systems with national footprints covering everywhere. We could get our video from these other sources. In fact, today we want to get our video on small screens over the mobile network. The spectrum has not moved to accommodate that shift in technology, innovation, and consumer demand. So when people in the United States, particularly regulators, look at the problem today, they see broadcasters like Dr. Evil, licenses that have been there for generations, and they're wanted for something newer and better and more valuable today, but the TV broadcasters are demanding these outrageous sums to move. Okay, so that's the Dr. Evil problem. This is not my characterization, it's the way regulators think about it. I think Dr. Evil is completely rational. No, he's not my hero, but I understand where he's coming from, okay? And I understand why the broadcasters wouldn't want to sell cheap. But the problem is that those over-the-air broadcast televisions aren't needed anymore. They're like appendices. They're vestigial organs. You can have them, but they're not doing any good. They're just taking up space. And in the United States, we have still 10% of the public, 10 million households, are still getting signals from broadcast TV, but we have satellite that completely take all the terrestrial broadcast TV completely. They can move. If you give me $3 billion, I'll make sure everybody in the country has cable broadcast television service. I'll do it this way. I offered that in 2009 to an open letter in the Financial Times to the chairman of the FCC. Anyway, so we don't, at a very low cost, $3 billion is nothing when it comes to clearing the entire TV band. But we still, even though the cost is low to clear the entire band, we still have 35 over-the-air broadcast channels allocated from 1952. So the way to get rid of them, and this is exciting for people who believe and understand and want to adopt markets to solve social problems, is what is called the overlay. This is not my original idea, but I've been pushing it hard in the United States. An overlay license. What does an overlay do? Okay, an overlay is a new right to use the TV band, use other bands and other examples, but here you have the spectrum allocated from the last century for television. There's still 35 channels there with some TV stations, 20 TV stations per market. What you do is you issue new licenses to use those same bands. You allow the existing TV stations to do everything they're doing. They're grandfathered or vested. They can do everything they're doing to keep broadcasting if they want to. You auction the new rights to use the licenses, and they have the new rights, the new holders have the right to immediately use the vacant channels that are not being used for broadcasting, and then a secondary right to use the broadcast channels that are in use, but only if they get permission of the TV station. They have to cut a deal. They have to pay the TV station, and the TV stations can either go off the air, they can share a channel with some other, they can compress their signals, or you can compress 95, 98% of your signal, but you can use a lot less spectrum to send the same signals. You can just go cable and satellite, which is what they've already done in large measure. So there are many ways to get rid of the existing stations and still have the content from the TV station distributed. But what you do is you allow bargains to exist because you get new property rights in the market that allow the old allocations to go away and new uses, broad flexible uses for, say, mobile cellular communications to take place. This is a market-oriented tool where you allow the entrepreneurs to raise the money to pay off the TV stations, to get rid of the current broadcasting, get the new technology in, get the old technology out. You can also use this in the very large problem of public radio bands. That is to say, there's more than half the spectrum in almost every country, including the US, is allocated to the military, to the Forestry Service, to the Department of Justice, to the Department of Education. Very inefficient, endemically used inefficiently. Old systems, too much spectrum. You could get a lot more mobile broadband if you could get access to those frequencies. You can issue overlays for private companies to come in and then work with public agencies to get them to use advanced radio systems. In fact, private investors can come in and pay for more advanced radio systems using much less spectrum and hand them over to the public sector agencies. These would be called overlays or hunting licenses, as one FCC commissioner calls them, and she's got a good take on this and is pushing forward the idea, which I'm happy to say. Anyway, so there are ways to have market orientation to the deregulation. I call it liberalizing the process of liberalization. You have market incentives with the overlays. You have decentralized decision-making. Instead of just having one bureaucrat, say from the Department of Commerce to a Department of Defense bureaucrat, hey, you should use new technology and use less spectrum and give that other stuff over to some private sector firm. There are no incentives for success. There's no penalty for failure. There's no time limit on those. The only industry that really benefits from those negotiations is the hotel and entertainment industry, because they always have the talks in Florida or Hawaii, sometimes in Colorado during ski season in the United States, because bureaucrats like to travel. But that's it. They just drag on forever. If you have market-oriented negotiations through an efficient property rights system with the overlays, you get much better cost-benefit calculations. You get to use capital markets where you can raise money and have better networks that you build for the users, and then capitalize on the new spectrum that's being released from that. You get efficient, you get profits. When you succeed, you get lost. When you fail, it's an efficient feedback loop. And that's what we ought to be doing today. So at the very end of my book, I have my favorite diagram from school. I like these. Who doesn't want to watch? You see, a famous Italian made the list. Inventor Marconi, regulator Hoover, entrepreneur Steve Jobs. So whereas Marconi and Jobs invented technologies and put them in the marketplace to try to improve social well-being, the first regulator of radio tried to centralize decision-making over the airways and created a Mother May system. So the correct answer is B, Hoover. So that's it. Thank you.
Tom, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We will collect some questions and comments. Of course, our story is a bit different, but it has something very similar when it comes to regulating TV, regulating content. There was the two priorities. Government owns the channel and keep on going with this monopoly that we for quite a while until it was challenging in very chaotic ways now. So who wants to ask questions?
Let me say about Italy. I, for years, did try to get somebody to write this book about Italy. And the reason is because you do have this fascinating history where in the 70s there was a challenge to, there were cable TV systems that started to be built. And local governments tried to stop that. And there was an assertion of a right through the Italian courts that the governments could not stop the building of the cable systems. And you would think that then cable would expand and grow. But what happened was that other entrepreneurs in the market saw that the same legal precedent could apply to broadcasting. And so what happened was that broadcasting came in the market in a very fluid way. And you had, by the 1980s, you had 40 over-the-air television stations in Rome. And as in the United States and most other places, cable comes because broadcasting is being suppressed by the regulator. Cable is an end run, trying to put spectrum in the market that is not regulated and suppressed. But in Italy, you got much more broadcasting because of this funny series of events in the legal system. So the cable never took off because of all the broadcasting. That's the story that's told in some, there's an Oxford University Press series that has some of this detail in it. I've tried to get somebody to do more. I know Berlusconi comes to the market, does some consolidation, and you have all this broadcasting around and forms these networks. I would love to see, particularly in English, a good updated version of the pattern of regulation in, through the free speech rights, through the court challenges, and through the spectrum allocation process. And of course, now there's coordination with the EU, Telecom Italia, and the carriers are involved heavily in EU, in European community regulatory proceedings and harmonization and so forth. So anyway, I just like to see that story written. So I would encourage you to encourage scholars here. Yeah.
So cable, lack of cable was unintended consequences extend to the problem with broadband deployment. So we risk, that way of getting broadband to people.
Right.
So
well, early in about 2003, I was asked to give a paper at the University of Montreal, Canada. And at that time, I went on the website of the Canadian regulator. And the Canadian regulator on their website boasted, we have the highest cable TV penetration anywhere in the world. Okay? And I smiled when I saw that because I knew, first of all, I knew it was false. And it's not true that I know the Dutch had a higher penetration in several countries. But anyway, they made this claim, and theirs was high. It was over 85% at the time. And I knew why they had a high penetration. The Canadian market, just look at a map of Canadian population. It's essentially all within 50 miles of the United States. Okay? The Canadian government does not want Canadians watching American television. They want to, just like the US government wants to control, okay? They want to control Canadian content. So they've always wanted to stop people from getting broadcasting or cable or satellite from the US. What happens is, by the early 1980s, there's satellite services that Canadians are grabbing because they have very little. Canadian Broadcasting Company had 1 or 2 channels. And they're getting all these broadcast signals, television signals coming in from the US. They're flocking to video. They're all getting fake Florida addresses that, even though it's illegal in Canada, they all have satellite dishes. Okay. So finally, the Canadian government says, that's too hard to control. What we're going to do is we're going to allow cable in Canada. And cable in Canada is a great business. Why? Because you have all this English language programming and some French language programming. But you know, it's a market that you can ride on these other bigger markets that have programming, and you just bring it in and give people these shows. And it sold, and they didn't like Canadian television because there's so little of it. So so they had a great market. But when it comes in, everybody buys it to get American programming, basically American and French programming in Montreal, Quebec. And they have rules about Canadian programs. They have quotas for Canadian television, which I love, because what's the difference between an American program and a Canadian program? How can you tell which is which? You know, if it's filmed in Montreal, but it's an American company with all American actors, filmed in English, written by Americans, is that Canadian programming? And this comes up all the time. So there's a point system in Canada.
To see how Canadian you are.
To show how Canadian your program is. And they give you points for, is the lead actor, the lead actress, the writer, the producer, the location. You know, my joke is if it's got beer and hockey, it's Canadian. But, you know, where it's filmed, what city, it has these, you just think about that. If you're watching something, is this Canadian? Well, it's filmed in Canada, but it's all American, so it's got an American script, and it's about America, and it's in English, it's in American English. Anyway, they have all these rules. Anyway, Canada brags that it has all this cable because they suppressed broadcasting, and everybody wanted to buy American programs, and they with their American programs, they got this quota of Canadian content. At the very same time, Italy had almost no cable, 2003, because they have all this broadcasting. So there was a very perverse claim in Canada, oh, we have all this broadcast of cable, but there was a total accident that they had the cable, they tried to stop it and couldn't, and had to let it so that people could get the American programs. It was actually a much more successful situation in terms of an open market for broadcasting in Italy. And as a result, cable didn't come in. Well, it turns out cable is also good for broadband, we discovered in the late 90s. But by that point, you know, all these other events have played out. And it is interesting that, yeah, cable's nice, but
Excuse me, is it a bit of a similar case in Switzerland? They have French, Italian, and German?
Well, they have a lot of cable, I know. And I don't know why they got cable there. So it could be. I want you to write that book. Because I'd like to read. I'd be a customer for any of these to see how every country, you know, in every region has its own interesting development, and the politics play a huge factor. By the way, I know in South Africa, they obviously under apartheid had a real problem. Not that Switzerland's apartheid, but it's got 4 languages and different cultures. So South Africa had a very big problem. And they just didn't do broadcasting at all. They didn't know how to handle television. So they had SABC, which was the British model, like BBC, government broadcasting. but they wouldn't go to a television system until the late 1970s, and any television. And they didn't know how to, so they did do it by race. They did apportion TV, the channels by race under apartheid. Did it that way. They were afraid about bringing in, if you're South Africa with English being a primary language, that bringing in racially mixed shows in the 1970s, that was very controversial. So anyway, governments all have these very parochial interests, and sometimes they just decide not to have. They just decide to block the whole technology.
Yeah. Questions or comments?
Can I just ask you a short question about the book you mentioned before, but I didn't take note. A short story of radio?
A short story of radio?
I think it's your
Harvard Business Review? Yeah. That, that's the long book, and then the short version. Yeah. Political spectrum, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And this little suggestion.
Yes, this is subliminal. This is when you're sleeping tonight, you'll think of this.
Just open up your Amazon app.
I will thank you for your speech, very interesting. I'm from Nokia, and I cover government relation activity. In the past, we did some trials with the government about sharing assets. It's an example like yours where the satellite spectrum was used in different business model to allocate incumbent usage with more mobile usage. And so from our point of view, the best usage of the spectrum, particularly thinking about the evolution to the Internet of Things, where not only a smartphone, it's our connection to the network, but many billion of things being connected to the network goes to much better usage of the spectrum. And this is, so I think, a point where I would ask you a comment about that. How the US are addressing this topic, or not? How you see the evolution of 5G network as a platform for the future internet?
Yes. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming. Obviously, Nokia has been as active in the birth of mobile as any company in the world, and continues to be. The success of liberalization is well known, but there's still great confusion as to how to promote it going forward. And I argue in the book that markets in radio spectrum are a great idea, and allowing prices to be observed for alternative uses of the different bands is also tremendously productive socially. There's a lot of talk about how sharing of the bands can be best done by unlicensed models or government-private partnerships, and I'm generally very critical of that approach. We have some of that. In general, what we've already done, to the extent that it's used, should be left alone, but the new allocations should focus very heavily on trying to get responsible economic agents, sometimes called companies, but not always, but generally to get firms competing in the marketplace to use their spaces to develop these new business models. We don't know how 5G fifth generation technologies will exactly come. And of course, Nokia is in the middle of trying to figure that out. But we want prices for different bands to be visible, not just government allocation saying, here, this is the way this is going to happen. The United States right now is doing a lot at a band at 3.5 gigahertz. There's a lot of regulatory overhead, and deals between parties are going to be very difficult to achieve. The government's going to have to make the sharing decisions as to how much interference will be allowed, what power levels, what technologies. That's not a good idea, okay? In general, what you want is the Germans, for example, just met with last week in Bonn, have a much broader band that is going to go out in big parcels to different competing companies. And they're going to be able to coordinate much better, in my opinion, in a competitive space. And there will be different prices seen for how much it costs to develop this on this technology versus doing something different over here. There could be a lot of harmonization, standardization. I expect there will be, because economies of scale are so pronounced. But you still will have different options for what bands you use, and those will have different prices. And they reflect some information that is extremely important and is lost when you say the government is going to adopt a sharing, what they sometimes call a sharing model or an unlicensed model. I want to say that sharing is absolutely ubiquitous. The most intensely shared spectrum in the world is the stuff that feeds our smartphones, but the sharing is coordinated by private companies that have authorization to control the bandwidth that is allocated to their license spaces. So yeah, we have, literally billions of customers using the same spaces, sharing it, but through network operators who invest in your products and infrastructure from your competitors and from device makers to accommodate what we are able to get in terms of our bandwidth. And it's a very changing, complicated problem that you do want to evolve. You don't want to fix it with some government rules that seem to work today, may or may not, but absolutely will not work 10 years from now. You know they're not going to work. You know they're going to have to evolve, just the same way television evolved, and is something quite different today than it was in the 50s, but we're stuck. We literally, in the United States, the regulators have, 95% of what I say is not even controversial to most of the regulators of either political party in the United States. And I get along with them pretty well. But, in terms of some of my views, but we today are literally dealing with decisions made in 1939 for television. VHF television was set aside in 1939. And we're still grappling with how we deal with those rules today. That's what we want to get away from. And unfortunately, with a lot of looking forward to even these exciting 5G technologies, the Internet of Things, and all these devices and health devices and everything else that will be making our lives better, we use the old models maybe unwittingly. We think we got newer technology, so it's going to work better. But it doesn't. It works worse because there's more contentiousness. With all the new technology, you got more choices. And you're suppressing more valuable stuff than ever before. So I'm optimistic overall that we're headed in the right direction. But the progress is too slow. We need to really take the lessons we've learned and apply them much more strenuously so that the Internet of Things can develop much more efficiently, faster, and with much more experimentation and competition, rather than running everything through government processes.
Thank you very much. Well, the story about Italy and cable is very straightforward, because the telephone company STEC, which was state-owned, had a legal monopoly alone on broadcasting. When somebody started to dig to have channels, one was in Vienna, not far away from here, and one in Sicily, they went to the government and said, well, you extend our monopoly also to cable. So cable was stopped because of that. So very straightforward, very simple.
Really?
And that's why we don't have, we didn't have, why we don't have cable. There is no cable to be.
And what year was that, or what regime?
That was, if I remember, 175, because I can't find out this. I can give you a copy. You read.
No, I don't. That's the problem, yeah.
Uh,
But I can send it through Google Translate. But if you would send it to me, that'd be good. Because, see, this book came out in the early 80s from Oxford University Press. It was 85. And Ellie Noam at Columbia is the editor, and he did a whole thing broadcasting in Europe. He went country by country. And he claimed that after that, there was a free speech precedent in the Italian courts that allowed companies to build cable systems without franchises, without
we don't have cable.
well, but
Because of that, because of the law.
well, then he said, well, his explanation is the opposite. His explanation is that
That
broadcasting.
cable, we have cable, we don't have.
No, his explanation is that the broadcasters, or potential broadcasters, saw this decision and they jumped into the market on the same precedent.
No, the cable was forbidden.
Okay, fine.
The 500 TV stations that you mentioned, they had the right to transmit only local. So if you wanted to be a national broadcast, you had to do like Berlusconi.
Yeah.
He
What did he do?
made a tape, multiplied,
Yeah.
and sent it to others, and they were one after the other, but more or less it was more or less simultaneous. Okay. And only afterwards we had a law was passed, which was a very.
Well, please tell me what you have on this, because I'd like to
Very
just straighten it out. Yeah.
And religion on the that they allowed the competition for. Another question was, there is one of the few areas in which Europe performed better than the US was in the early stages of mobile telephone. And that's, I think, because we had the famous call party pace, whilst you had the calling, no, we had the calling party pace, whilst you had for a long time the call party.
Receiving party base.
The receiving, yeah, the call party, the receiving party pace. And that was, I mean, in that case, the regulator, let us say the norm was better the European one, and we went for a short period of time. We had a better diffusion of several phones. But that,
Yeah, no, there are a couple of things there. First, the U.S. was first in cellular. It started that first. Then, and talk a lot in the book about the fact that cellular took forever, and it was never considered to be a mass market service. It was never taken seriously by regulators. They thought it was just a status symbol for the rich. It was never, and the private sector didn't take it that seriously either. There was a famous study in 1980 that AT&T commissioned, McKinsey and Company, and they were predicting 20 years out how many cell phone subscribers in the United States, 1980 to 2000. And they said that there would be 980,000 subscribers by the year 2000. And there were 109 million. So to be off by 2 orders of magnitude, that's difficult. That's difficult. But that was the under projection for what was going to happen. Nobody saw this as a mass market. So cellular coming in, the US did prove that it was a mass market, potentially, because it comes in at just, even at high prices. I mean, this initial cell phones were $3,000. Anyway, at high prices, by the middle 1980s, it's coming in, okay? And then other countries, you know, they come in the 1G analog. what happens is that the Europeans, for industrial policy reasons and to favor European manufacturers, do have an efficient and to try to harmonize against the United States, which is a big common market of its own. They do a very smart thing by getting 2G licenses out very quickly. And by 1989, the digital licenses are coming out. By 1992, it's essentially over. The United States is going much slower. We had a big fight over radio spectrum, what bands to use, and how to move out the incumbent users in what's called the emerging technologies band. We don't get licenses out until 1995. We finally adopted auctions, and those worked fine, but we didn't get the allocations out until 95. So all through that early period, essentially 6 years, the United States is lagging because of spectrum policy. Now, some people, Europeans, often think it was smart to have a mandated standard across Europe, which was GSM and Nokia and Alcatel and Ericsson and Siemens, and not to have, other non-harmonized or competing technologies. The U.S. left it open, and we came up with GSM and CDMA, a competitor. I think that was the right approach. I think CDMA has done very well. It's integrated now into all the standards. It's certainly been a godsend in terms of data. The GSM standard was built for voice. CDMA was built for data, and 3G, 4G. It's done very, very well. So I think that was good. It was open. And what was bad about it is the United States did not push forward very rapidly. In terms of calling party pays, and I do not agree that calling party pays was better than, even though there was early on, there was a problem. People would not turn on their phones because they didn't want to pay for the call. But just look at the data. The U.S. has consumed way more voice minutes than any other country. Way more. The prices are lower per minute. I'm an economist. I'm going to look at output. I don't know what the better system is, but the United States is much cheaper than European countries for voice. Has been. Now, and for data, it's harder to compare. Actually, one of the problems with empirical work, I loved the cellular world empirically up until about 2003. You didn't have to worry about texting. You didn't have to worry about mobile broadband. Now, you have data on how much people are paying, but they pay for three services, and it's hard to, when we had voice minutes and we had revenue per month, we could do statistics much easier. And I published a paper in 2009 on that data, and I was very familiar with that. The U.S. did just very well on that. Even though we were late, we were very late. That hurt us, no question. And we've got some problems that on zoning and location of local government issues that are a big problem in the U.S. I mentioned them in the book. I don't talk a lot about it, but I also know that the Europeans have those problems, and I know that the Swiss, I talked to earlier this week, the Swiss regulators, they talked about how impossible it is for environmental reasons to build new base stations, and said that flat out you can't have a new competitor in the Swiss market because you can't get permits to build any towers, none. They won't allow it. They have 3 operators, that's enough. The Swiss are rich, they're not gonna allow competition. That's kind of their attitude. So we share some of that in the US. We have problems in cities like San Francisco getting siting for new base stations. So that does limit competition and efficiency in the network. But I don't know, there are papers written on this. There's a lot of interest in CPP versus RPP on that. But I've seen how much cheaper our prices are, so I don't, and minutes. I mean, it's just minutes of talk time. So, and with texting and mobile, minutes are going to voice minutes. Nobody talks on voice. My daughters don't know you can use a phone for a voice call. That's just an app that they haven't heard of. They take us for Snap, for pictures, text,
music.
All that.
It's interesting that you mentioned the same problem with calling versus paying upon a city call that we've seen with the penny post. But nobody wanted to get mail, basically, because you didn't know what was in the envelope. And you didn't want to pay for that. You're paying for the envelope coming in, and perhaps there's somebody asking you to pay your tax. So the penny post idea was basically charging people sending the mail.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, lower transaction costs dramatically, but it's not the same situation.
Well, we don't have it, so you have to pay it. Or you used to pay before to get the mail?
Well, before the penny button, before the postage system,
Yes.
the receiver was paid.
Yeah.
In English.
Ah,
So you got your mail, and you were paying it.
Yeah.
The beauty of the penny post
yeah.
was precisely, you were just.
Well, yeah, and we do have a problem with our system in terms of getting telemarketing calls. And we're addressing that now through regulation, but we have a big problem with it. And there should be a payment for unwanted phone calls. And maybe the argument would, I didn't take it in this context, but maybe the argument now is that more than half of the phone calls I get are unwanted. I mean, unwanted. Not talking about from my daughters. Unwanted from marketers who I don't want to talk to, and scam, fraud, that sort of thing. And so maybe this is less of a problem because of calling party pays versus receiving party pays. I don't know.
Could be, more of the calls I make are unwanted, but that's because I do some fundraising.
Your calls are always wanted, Alberto.
There's no other common questions. I would like just to thank you, Tom, for this founder's talk. It's not, we didn't get as many people attending it as we should, but I'm very happy it's recorded and broadcast and will be available for the ages insofar as the internet exists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
How late was it when U.S. law mentioned it?
Well, it's in the 1927 Radio Act, yeah.
Because either hypothesis was disbanded by Einstein, if I remember well, 1915.
Yeah.
So it's kind of surprising that 10 years later, an official document of the United States still mentions something which since 10 years did not exist. I mean, it's cute.
Well, my knowledge of that actually just relates to satellite television. It's a beautiful new series on Einstein on National Geographic called Genius. And apparently it was a very badly taken by the police right in the world. So there may be some sort of fraction.
Yeah, but 10 years later.
Yes. But the world of politics is never up to science, is it?
Yeah. No, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would be slow. but you're right. I mean, they should have been more up to date on that. Yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. And not too quiet.